morning, everyone, and thank you for being with us. Welcome to our last session for this semester, for the spring semester of Women on the Move. But I will say it doesn't really feel like spring today in New York. I am Marjorie Schuster, coordinator of our literary events here at the Temple Emanu-El Streicker Center. If you've been with us, you know we have met 7 amazing and fantastic female authors. And today we really end on a high note because we are lucky enough to have Tessa Hadley with us today, all the way from her home in Cardiff, Wales. She is the well-known and prolific British author, and it's really, really an honor to have her. I hope a lot of you have read her book, Free Love, or will order it, and today we will discuss it. Jordana Horn is our moderator today. She's with the podcast, the Call Your Mother podcast on kveller.com. As usual, please write your questions in the chat feature of Zoom. We'll try to get to as many as we can. And I would like to thank the Samuel I. Newhouse Foundation for their support of this series, because today is actually the 30th Women on the Move series session that we've done since we've started. And it's really been wonderful, and I'd like to thank them very much. So it is now my great pleasure to welcome Tessa Hadley and Jordana Horn. Good morning, Tessa. Good morning, Jordana.
Morning, Jordana. Good morning, Marjorie.
Thank you so much for being with us from so far away.
It's lovely to just a little glimpse, a virtual glimpse of New York, which I love so much.
Well, please come see us soon at our temple. All right, have a wonderful discussion.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And as I told Tessa before we started, I'm a tremendous fan. So this is a terrific honor for me to be able to be here. And I wanted to kick off the discussion by just saying that I understand that this is the first of your books to be set in an era that's not the here and now, specifically for those who may not have gotten to read it yet. Free Love is set in 1960s Britain. So how did you make that choice? How did you do your research? And the book is a deep dive into the contrast between youth and middle age. And you replicate that so well in your setting contrasts between the British suburbs and Ladbroke Grove in London.
Yes, it's the first novel that I've just pushed back a little bit further in historical time than I've ever done before. I've set lots of my novels in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and coming forward to the present. But I have played around a little bit more boldly with time in my short stories. And I think that the impulse to write this novel actually came out of one of my short stories, not from the material of the story itself, but it was set in the home counties, which are those rather stodgy in those days, respectable suburbs around London, sort of privileged and calm and perhaps comically dull. And that story was set there, and it was set in the 60s. And I had such fun writing it. It's odd because it's not my time. I was a little girl in the 60s, and it's certainly not my place. I've never lived in the home counties. My cousin lived there for a while, and maybe that's a little bit to do with why it's oddly that very place that perhaps is, as I say, comically stuffy and dreary in popular imagination in those days, somehow seems to me magical and full of power to make a story out of. So there again, in that short story, I had a young girl who was of the sort of most constrained and respectable family, being borne off for a day and a night by some bad boys from Oxford to a kind of informal party, and coming back utterly changed and yet unchanged. And somewhere in that story, although the characters are not the same in the least, that I think that was the seeds of this book. And there's probably even more to say about, why the 1960s. I'm looking for origins, I think, of sort of where we are now.
Mm-hmm. And I know that in past interviews, you have talked about this idea that the late 60s was a liminal moment that led us into modernity in many ways. And so it seems particularly appropriate that here in this book, you have Phyllis, this married mother of 2, who runs away from her conventional life to be with her younger lover. And that decision comes about sort of accidentally. Can you talk a little bit about what's behind that choice and why you chose to write about that?
I mean, I really do think it's a bit of a sliding doors moment. If he comes to dinner, he's the young son of friends of Phyllis and her husband, Roger, though they don't know each other terribly well at all. And if he hadn't kissed her in the garden, and why does he kiss her? Not out of passion, not out of even strong desire, to be honest, out of a need to know that he was anti-bourgeois and daring and audacious and young and different. If he hadn't done that, I can imagine a whole life for Phyllis in which she went on being a contented, rather charming, rather gorgeously dressed, good-looking housewife and good mother to her children. And instead, this opening, this portal opens up in time for her, and she steps through it into something completely new. And so in that story of Phyllis's moment of revolution, personal revolution, I'm kind of able to access something much bigger that was going on between an older, more constrained, more conventional way of doing things and post-war Britain, a little bit grey, not very nice food on the table, politics of common sense in a way. And then instead she steps out into a world of variety and colour and risk and danger, and the class boundaries muddled up and everybody enjoying stepping over them instead of guarding their boundaries ferociously. And so she enacts in her own, perhaps limited person in a way, but she must have something that lets her do it. She enacts a transition that happened in the wider culture.
Yes, and it's so beautifully done. And it was so interesting to me, you alluded to it, that Nicky initiates this first kiss more out of an effort to assert his unconventionality than out of any, compelling emotion. And similarly, in a way, I think that Phyllis is kind of embarking. It has a little bit of a project kind of feel to it, that it's a project of sexual reclamation, of going back to this youthful, invigorating lack of inhibition and the lack of judgment that makes everything much more fun.
Yeah. Although she wouldn't have any of those words for what she's doing, or be able to describe it. That the words, if you like, perhaps they're words from the 1970s. She's unawakened and hasn't got much vocabulary, but I think you're absolutely right, Jordana. She's got really strong instincts. Something instinctually that evening tells her to save herself. And the build-up to the kiss, which Nicky, as we're saying, sort of proffers in an experimental vein, and which she fastens upon so hungrily, the build-up is that she suddenly feels the reality of growing old and away from being desirable. I think maybe in 2022, we're slightly shocked at the idea of a 40-year-old woman could feel that coming. But I think things were different in 1967. I can remember my own mother's 40th birthday and a sort of fury in her if anybody found out how old she was. And she was fiddling her age on official forms and things. So, it was a watershed time, and Phyllis hasn't thought about any of that with the top of her head, but somewhere she's got a sort of passionate interior, and she touches Nicky actually accidentally, sort of leaning forward over him, giving him a gin and tonic, although he's already slightly drunk. And because her hand's cold, he recoils from her. It's it's a misunderstanding, if you like. It's literally her cold touch. And she thinks, I'm repulsive to him. And although she has pre-imagined with lovely kind of clarity and sanity, it'll be fine. I'll have my hobbies. I'll have my family. The visceral reality of not being wanted just sort of strikes into her like a blow from a sword. And that's why when he then kisses her, he's rather astonished by her response. And he sort of thought, oh, I thought I was the crazy one in bourgeois suburbia. And actually, it's bourgeois suburbia is totally unhinged, he thinks, in a bit of a panic, and goes off that evening, assuming he'll never see her again. But she
right. I love that and that there's this idea of, He doesn't leave her his number. He doesn't, there's no insinuation or intimation that anything will happen in the future. And yet Phyllis sees it quite clearly. The door's open. I am going through this door. I'm going to find this guy. I'm going to give him back his shirt that got wrecked when they were looking for the shoe. And she's very adamant about it. And so each one of them embarks upon this relationship, in this assertion of self, with the other person sort of as a mirror. And I found that so interesting because when you talk, obviously there are the intended implications of free love and the whole late 60s and the idea, but that this is really, it's less love as people coming together and more love as people finding themselves individually.
You're so right. You're right. And I really intend the book to have lots of irony around the project of free love and perhaps of love at all. Not total irony. There is lots of genuine love in the book. I'm not sure quite how much there is between Phyllis and Nikki. They need each other and want each other, and one has to say sexually it's very good for both of them. So, hey, who's complaining? But it is not a romantic story about a woman who is suffocated inside an awful situation who finds joy and freedom when she gets out of it. That's sort of not what the story is. I hope that my narration of what happens sits quite a long way back from that. And I'm just watching this dance of misunderstanding, which nonetheless throws up its amazing moments for them. And they're good together for a while.
There was a sentence that I've seen quoted from the book in various interviews, and that made such an impression on me when I read it, where it says, Phyllis, and you'll probably know immediately what I'm talking about. Phyllis knew that her betrayal of her husband and children was wrong, but in the same impersonal, dulled way that she knew from school about the Treaty of Vienna or the abolition of the Corn Laws. That is such a wry and funny sentence. But I wonder if you also find that there's sort of a dangerous element of the lines of right and wrong not being clearly drawn. And I will say, full disclosure, that as a mother myself, I do judge Phyllis for abandoning her original children. And I read that you do not feel that way about her. And I'd love to hear more about that.
I'm not sure she's the person you would choose as your mother, because she does walk out on them. Again, I am just watching her do it. And I do think that there is something to be offered in her defense. Her relationship with her daughter, who's 15, is shaky anyway. They're not alike and they don't get on that well. It's not vicious, but it's problematic. It's her little boy who she adores, and you can sort of absolutely within that rather patriarchal world where she's the housewife and mother. Of course, it's the young man, the young master who all her joy is poured into. And she's about to be separated from him because as a very small boy, he's going to be sent away to a boarding school, which was the way and still is in some quarters the way that the British ruling classes made their men by sending them off at quite young age, sometimes much younger than little Hugh in this book.
Right. It does explain a lot.
Yeah, I think it does explain a lot. I honestly think, and I think I sort of say it somewhere, that in a slightly hidden part of Phyllis, it's not wholly articulated to herself. She wouldn't put it forward as an excuse ever. She never does to anybody. But somewhere in herself, she feels that she's going to have the love of her life, that little boy. Because it's a companionable and pleasant marriage, but it's not a passionate one. She's going to have the passionate love of her life, her boy child, taken away from her and turned into a man through that rather brutal system that pertained at that point even more strongly than it does now. And that in exchange, she's going to have this lover. Now, I don't think that's all right, but it makes me understand what she's doing better. Yeah. She does it. That moment opens up and she goes through it. And there's a huge risk and it's dangerous and there are consequences. And I think of all the characters in my book, actually, the consequences are most awful for little Hugh, who does go away to school, as he was going away anyway, and it would have been awful anyway. But there's something additional in losing his mother in such a shaming way, and he comes to hate her. He can't forgive her. There's no room in his future for this mother who is sexually compromising, and that's all agony to him.
Yes, and also the vehemence with which, I mean, it was a very, there's so much poignancy in that she leaves, and that the children are saying to each other and to themselves, well, she has to be back for Christmas.
Yeah.
You know, obviously that just like the sun has to rise in the morning.
The sun has to rise. Yes. Surely she'll be doing our Christmas stockings. Yes. Yes.
Right.
And then he does get a Christmas stocking, which has obviously been put together by his dad a bit and their nice cleaning lady a bit. And he unwraps it. And he doesn't touch it. He just puts it on the side in his bedroom, and he doesn't even eat the chocolate. And that's a bit of a shriveling moment, actually. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And it tugged so much at my heart, that relationship between Phyllis and her son, and how she's so fearful of its imminent fracture, and yet. So she sort of does a full guillotine on it by going about her course. But I wanted to ask you to what extent, do you think that she's looking and maybe finding more than she expected, looking for sort of another kind of son in Nicky?
There's got to be some bit of that mixed into it, but not really. She actually is quite wary of mothering him. She doesn't want to go around picking up his socks and changing his sheets.
As appealing as that is.
Yeah, as appealing as that is, absolutely.
It's a very sexy lifestyle.
I think, I kind of like that about her, actually. I think I would like her less if she did leave and then mother a young lover. I sort of, perhaps like is not the right word. I find myself, even though I invented her, sort of admiring her audacity. She does this thing, and you can judge it as you like, but she does it wholeheartedly. Like,
true.
When she turns up at Nicky's room on the night she actually leaves her family and home, having not known she was going to do that, and suddenly she's there at his door, and he wasn't expecting her, and he's fast asleep, and it's winter, and he's got no clothes on. And he opens the door to her, and she's laughing, not weeping, not making a meal of it, not saying, "Oh, poor me, it's agony, I love you," but laughing. And I think there's something kind of pagan about her. Perhaps that's a good word for it, which is a little terrifying also, and hurtful for those around her. But I don't think she's going to mother this young lover. She has bought extra time to give away a little bit of story. Later in the book, she sort of thinks for a moment that maybe her menopause has come, but it isn't that.
It is not. No,
it isn't that. And she's got extra years, and she's living them in a big way, in a crazy way, at all kinds of risk to herself as well as to others. So
yes.
In the end, that the business of the book and of me is to just let her go and do her thing. And then, of course, lots of readers are very upset with her for what she does. Mine too, because it wouldn't have been a very exciting novel if she'd just said, of course, novelists have to make something happen.
I guess that's certainly true in terms of the excitement factor. It's less, I guess it's less that I'm mad at her as a reader and more that I'm sad for Hugh and for what becomes of Hugh, and sad for Colette also. And, the mother-daughter relationship between Phyllis and Colette is so masterful. And each one of them is struggling with these issues of identity, the child going through adolescence, and the mother sort of reclaiming, I guess, this sort of second adolescence. And they're both trying to express their own identity through defying societal expectations. And I wanted to know if you talked a little bit about it, Phyllis. Do you empathize with Colette? Do you see any of yourself in her and in her experience?
Yeah, I'm probably somewhere on the spectrum much closer to Colette, who's bookish and not good at being glamorous in the way her mother is. That's yes, definitely. I'm sympathetic to her. I find her very easy and great fun to inhabit. I think that she is the survivor of the mother's leaving. I actually think there are certainly moments when I think I write somewhere like, she's discovering a whole new world of being in the counterculture, in the crazy, in the raggedy curtains at the bedsit windows, and the whole sort of otherness of West London as it was in the 1960s. She loves it. It's just catnip to her. It's so thrilling at 16, 17 to be free of your dull home. And then there's her mother's footprint everywhere.
Everywhere.
New continent should have been trackless, and instead her mother's footprint is everywhere on the sand before her. And there's quite a bit of chagrin in Colette. But on the other hand, her mother's new flat becomes a launch pad for Colette to dive wholeheartedly into new ways of being. And she knows how to use it, and she does use it. She's a winner, I think. I feel so very confident when she sort of disappears out of the frame of the book at the end that she's all right. Not all right like cozy and safe and nice, but she's launched on something big. She's used what her mother did to make room for herself. And actually, probably their relationship's the better for it. It's with the boy that it's disastrous.
And you feel okay about her and Paul, about Colette and Paul?
Yeah, I do actually. I mean, I wouldn't feel okay if she was my daughter. I'm not looking from that perspective here. Right. It was so characteristic of that moment. And I think it was true actually in the 70s as well, when I was a teenager, that there was an enormous amount of danger around. People were grabbing for life with both hands, with a sort of contempt for caution. We'd had caution, and it was a bit grey, and it was boring, and we didn't want it anymore. And the terrible stories that one has, which I'm certainly not going to share with you, from those times where we did things that, mostly our mothers didn't know about, and risked things and hooked up with unsuitable people. That was the story of those decades. And I feel that with every good sense, we have come back from that, actually. And probably parents are more protective and children are more cautious, I suspect, now. It was a rash time. They were rash times.
Yes. And I think that it seems like the pendulum of history. I feel we inevitably will swing back, because surely people can't handle being tracked by telephone and text. There's that inherent rebelliousness that you don't get when your mother knows what time your train got in.
In my teens, when I was, I suppose, 18 or 19, I had lovely parents who loved me very much, but I went off to Italy to be an au pair. They had no idea what the address was. And we hadn't noticed that there was no train station at the place I thought I was going to be employed, though I hadn't had any contact with them. That's mad. When we talk about it now, we can't quite believe how, and in fact, guess what? I was picked up by a gigolo in Rome who helped me buy a ticket to the right station because my Italian was virtually non-existent. It was fine. It was fine. I got away from him intact. But what crazy stuff. And yet I had very loving parents who were quite concerned about me. But different times, different customs.
So true. But that's the tip of the iceberg of stories that I'm sure you won't share within this context. But I would say that, you certainly have, you have these stories, you have this experience, yet you've said before that you are so grateful to not have been a debut author at age 25 and to have made your debut publishing your first novel in your 40s. Can you talk more about that?
I mean, of course, at the time, I wasn't grateful.
Sure.
Maybe not at 25, but certainly by 30. I was writing and I was failing. And it was very painful. I didn't know what to do with myself. I didn't feel I was any good at anything else. And I was a mother as well. And I was moderately good at that, but nothing spectacular. I
wasn't aware that there was an award ceremony, but I'll look into that after the Zoom.
I know. But I used to think, look, she's doing that and she seems to be finding it very easy. Anyway, so it was difficult at the time, but actually you're quite right. I was a slow developer in writing, and I can sort of relate that to something about me. I think I certainly was impressionable, so I was soaking it all in, and I was trying to write other people's books and obediently give back out what I'd already read, only different. And I don't know why it took so long, but it did take until my late 30s, early 40s, where I just started to find my own words in sentences, to find my own, this is what I sound like. Oh, I know this. Oh, I have that to say. Oh, I have that thought. And it was really coming from me. Not that I was telling my own story, but I was telling stories close to home, and I was authoritative. I think that's a good word to use. I somehow found authority, whereas I had been before submissive and obedient, and that's actually no good for writing. No.
Right. Maybe a degree of uncertainty that certainly isn't in your books now. I mean, your books are very poetic depictions of the intricacies of familial life and of married life. And I don't know that a person with less experience under their belt would have been able to write free love so well.
No. So I'm glad that I took all that time and therefore learned those things and knew what I thought. Also glad, there's another way of being glad, although it's very mean to be glad at the expense of your younger self who would have loved to be working and writing, but never mind. I like it that I had those long times when I was sort of nobody. I went to the school gate, and I don't mean to imply that I'm any tremendous thing now, but to not have a success, to not have a public persona, to be quite cast down sometimes, to be wondering what I was going to do, to feel such big doubt. I actually think, I don't know, am I being puritanical? Pain is good for you or something like that. But I feel as if it tempers you in a way that's useful for one's insight. And that to be meeting lovely people who say, I liked your book, it made sense to me early on. Well, I don't know. I'm not sure that would have been such a good education somehow. Does that make sense? Absolutely.
I think that humility never hurt anyone. And
something like that, which does sound rather puritanical and old-fashioned, but I think I do think something probably like that, at least for writing. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And maybe for everything.
Right. Maybe. So when you published your first novel, can you talk a little bit about that time in your life in your 40s, transitioning from being home with your children to becoming a published writer, to what that was like for you and how that maybe changed your perception of the very subjects about which you were writing?
Yeah. I mean, it was a marvelous time. It was an extraordinary thing because as it happened, and maybe not coincidentally, at the same time my youngest son was quite little, 2 or 3, I think. No, that's not right. Not by the time I'm first published. She's a bit older than that. But anyway, I still have my boys at home. One of my stepsons living with me as well. The big house to run chaotically or fail to run. And I was also teaching, which I hadn't done before. I really had been eccentrically almost at home, but suddenly I was out in the world and I was teaching literature and I was loving that. I was finishing a PhD on Henry James, and then I wrote my first novel. This is so not me. I am so not Superwoman. I'm actually quite indolent and quite private, but there was some adrenaline fueled kind of everything came together at once, and it was a wonderful time. But on the other hand, it changed my life hugely and wholly inside, to feel read, to feel like I could do this thing, the only thing on earth I really wanted to do, the writing. How wonderful. So the blessedness of it was enormous. But of course, I was still mostly at home with a family, and I was fitting my writing, as I always had done, including when the writing was not good, around that life, which is fine. I mean, that one should never protest about, because actually having a very old-fashioned arrangement where a husband who went out to work and earned a living and children who went to school all day, that's kind of perfect for writing, actually. Right. I didn't find that difficult at all. That was like set up perfectly. Once I knew what I could do and that someone would want to read it. So good times to remember. Yeah. And it hasn't failed me. It hasn't failed to go on making me happy that I'm doing this thing and that there are people out there who like to read what I write. And of course, one's always consumed by doubt, Oh yeah, that one's all right, but will they like the next one? Can I make this one work? So it's never comfortable, but it's always brilliant, exciting.
That's wonderful. And you mentioned that you had done your academic work studying Henry James. And I wanted to know to what extent his work influenced yours and what other writers you find particularly interesting as an author. I know that you're a devout fan of D.H. Lawrence.
All those great writers, I mean, they make me who I am, like they do anybody who's someone who loves reading, who's formed by reading, whose thought and opinions and politics formed by reading. They're so fundamental. And I do feel also the mulch of their conquests of form and style. They're just deep down inside me or any writer of our era. But there's a funny sort of, if I let Henry James' sentences, or for that matter, D.H. Lawrence's sentences, I think, percolate into my actual daily writing, there would be something wrong. One needs to read the contemporary. Although the contemporary, I would stretch quite a long way. I would say that anything within 50 years of where we are now will do. You can eat that alive and it will be there in your work. Whereas there's just some sort of historical boundary across which you don't want to sound like Henry James. You'd sound awful because he's superb and he was writing in 1904 and you're writing in 2022 and that's going to be silly. So interesting. So those great writers make you and make your sensibility and your perceptions. But then there are the contemporary writers, as I say, quite a loose category. And I don't know, Alice Munro was very, very important for me. Marvelous short story writer, except are they short stories? They're almost growing into novels. There's such an extraordinary form that she invents and deploys in her unique way. Nadine Gordimer, South African writer, and Coetzee also, they were very important to me. Although they were also problematic because their material seemed so superbly moral and political and urgent. And I think that was some of those bad books I was writing were over-influenced by trying to do that, but not be an engagé writer in South Africa. So, it wasn't the right terrain. But Elizabeth Bowen, who's a marvelous, an older writer, Anglo-Irish writer you probably know, and I love her. She's a great influence on me. Her sentences keep me up to the mark. Mavis Gallant, Canadian writer, I love the same tension and brilliance, never a slack moment, never a stupid or ordinary thing. And it's so easy to lapse and write something stupid and ordinary, and then you read them, have them open beside you when you're writing, and they lift you up. Yes,
and I had read that you give your work fully formed and finished over to your publisher, that there's not is that accurate, or
no, I think I don't write a loose first draft and have anybody look at that. I don't write a loose first draft at all. I know some of Alice Munro, for instance, does something like that, I think, although maybe that's more a matter of bits and pieces which she weaves gradually together. No, I sort of start at the beginning and I write as I write it, I think, is going to be the final version. It's not thin or loose, it's tight. But of course, then, myself, I will then go back through and pull things out and put things in and change things. And then I hand over to my wonderful editors, both in the UK and the US, doing it simultaneously. That's how we've always done it, and they both have an input. And no, I do change quite a lot. But you're right that I don't write that sort of sketch. Right. I don't know why. Just don't do that.
I'm going to make sure, I know we have quite a bit of questions from our viewers, and so I want to bring them in here. Jean comments, I'm a product of the seismic 60s. I do admit that traditions played a part in my willingness or lack of willingness to participate. And she asks, did the author Erica Jong have any influence on your writing?
I read her, but a long time ago. So I think not, except that audacious moment of women's writing where women opened up about their sexuality in explicit ways. Obviously, that's somewhere there in the background. Yes. Yeah. But not explicitly. Yeah.
And, Susan asks, she says, Tessa, thank you. Please comment on your character's love of disorder. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing this, and I apologize for my ignorance right up front. The nostalgie de l'abus that seems to give them freedom. And also on the repetition of Phyllis's story in her husband's love for Jean. That earlier story undercut the singularity of Phyllis's love for Nicky.
Yeah. The second point is, of course, very important to my story. And in a way, you're right, it undercuts. It's all very well. Something revolutionary happened in the 1960s. People did what they'd never done before. There was something crazy and disordered in it. But the truth was that women have been passionate always, and often in various previous eras, they have followed their heart, followed their body, followed their passion. And it turns out, the 1940s weren't really, the lid was not on quite so tightly as you might have thought. And it was very important to say that, because actually every decade in the 20th century at least is, churning with stories of heartbreak and wrong choices, regretted, passions pursued or not pursued. And I absolutely didn't want to write a book which seemed to say that sex was discovered in 1960, because that's
yes. No, I've heard it was around before.
Yes. The desire for disorder, that's very deep, I think, in perhaps not in everybody, but maybe in everybody. And it's fascinating to the writer, because as I said at the beginning, in order to write a novel, you have to have something happen. And in order for something to happen, you have to kind of pull apart order to some extent. And then often the very form of the novel is a contest, if you like, between order, which is having a narrative that will pull you through and bring you to an ending and give you a comprehension of what's happened. And at the same time, this sort of energy that is pulling apart the coherence of what the novel is trying to lay down. And that energy is essential to the novel being alive and being exciting. So I think both inside an individual, but also inside a fictional form, it's a continual tug of war between an impulse to control and an impulse to rip away from control.
And that dovetails nicely into Rosalind asks, she says, this has been my favorite author interviewed thus far, likely in part because I am the age of 70. I will read Ms. Hadley's book. Would you say that your story raises in part the conflict of the biological clock of fertility and childbearing occurring at a time in a woman's life when there's this intense desire for individual freedom, for exploration, and for adventure?
Yes, I mean, I think I do write about that quite often in my stories and my novels, perhaps less as time goes on. But yes, Phyllis's youth has been taken up in making a home for these young children to come up, as it were, through her life and be the future. And that works brilliantly for everyone it works brilliantly sometimes for everyone. And when it works, what a good system. But somewhere, Phyllis, something unvisited, unexamined in Phyllis has been put aside. And then in a kind of last-ditch moment, she grabs for it, snatches at it, and, I have to say, gets it, for which is a picture in itself. When you're thinking about which story to write, how to tell your story, it's a kind of heat that you feel for, in a way. You reach for the thing that's generating the most heat, and it's her doing that transgressive, dangerous, hurtful thing that makes the fuel that makes the novel burn. And one doesn't need to think that it's a good thing or that it wouldn't be better if nothing burned. They were.
Right. Ruthie says, I cannot wait to get my hands on this book. I'm curious if the character of Phyllis might be fashioned after a woman you may have known.
Not really, although always when one's making up a character, you're like a jackdaw, taking little bits of brightness from everywhere. So I think a little bit I've used my own mother, who did not leave her marriage or do anything so rash, but she had something of Phyllis's. She had all that attractiveness, that sitting at the dressing table in the opening pages, kind of in her petticoat, backcombing her hair. I can remember my mother doing that awful thing to her hair that women used to do to give it a body, and with her perfume and all of that. So something in her self-possession and her aura and her attractiveness I've stolen from my mum. But I think I weirdly write my mum over and over in my books, which is what a funny thing. And then I stole some things from books. There's a lovely British writer called Nell Dunn. I don't know whether she's read in the States. She's an elderly lady now, and she's absolutely not somebody that Phyllis is based on. But she was a sort of upper class, privileged woman who rejected it all and moved in to live, I think, in Battersea in London, in fact. The little bit late on in the book, I'm not really giving anything away, where Phyllis ends up working in a factory, not for very long, an awful, scruffy, little, tiny pie factory, alongside a gang of crazy girls who have no idea what they're doing with their lives. They're uneducated and they're wild and they're kind of gorgeous and they sing with heavenly voices. And I sort of borrowed that a little bit from some of Nell Dunn's stories. She wrote Poor Cow and Up the Junction in the 60s about that experience. And I think it was from Nell's books. I know her a little bit, but not very well at all. She's stunningly lovely old lady, a really beautiful. I think that I got from Nell that the real excitement of the revolution she undergoes for Phyllis is not so much about radical politics, about war and global injustice and things. She takes all that on. It matters. It's important. But it's actually the class change. It's mixing it all up. It's the release from being middle class and the romance, if you like, of that diving into working class experience. I got from Nell's books and from Nell herself how that's the extraordinary melting pot of her moment. And that excites her as much as anything.
Mm-hmm. C wants to know if you see any similarity to between the 60s chaos and dangerous times, similarity to today.
Yeah, I must have been thinking of that, mustn't I, in choosing to go in search of origins at an originary moment in the 60s where order and containment are being pulled apart in an unstable world. So yeah, I suppose we can't see it, can we? You can't see the wood for the trees. We can see the wood of the 1960s. We sort of know now enough about what it was and how it made us. And we might look, hopefully, to our present day and think out of some of this chaos and this real uncertainty quite as to what's going on and how dangerous a moment it is. And I don't just mean the war in Ukraine, I mean much more than that. Maybe a new radicalism and a fresh take politically, globally, can come about. But I'm not a political analyst, so I'm tentative in saying that. It does feel like a moment of shake-up in the same way, actually, as the 60s was.
Turbulence.
Turbulence, yeah. Not good to live, but it was better to live there. I mean, there was an immense amount of naivety then. I think that's what I knew anyway, but reading around the 60s, because it was so new, I think people had a really exaggerated sense of quite what, dropping out and tuning in and turning on could achieve. There was lots of naivety, and that's of course comical, a little disturbing. We're less naive now, but perhaps we're more anxious too.
I was about to say unhappy.
Yeah, that'll do. Yes.
Sharon says that she felt that the daughter, Colette, was less shocked to discover her mother's new life than she would have expected, and that she was also more forgiving than she would have expected. Would you please speak to that?
I think it's because Colette's imaginative. So I almost think she's anticipating what she's going to find. I mean, when she first finds the streets that her mother's living in, that shocks her because she's imagined it'll be pretty, because everything her mother touches is pretty, and it's not pretty. It's dodgy and dark and thrilling. Colette loves it for herself. I think Colette she's at the beginning of the book, she's actually a girl and she's got very little experience, but she's just got that big mind, which is already craning forwards into the future and into freedom. So it is amazing how you can step out of one world into another and take it in your stride sometimes. Some people can. And even though you've never seen any of this before, you know straight away how to do it, what to look like, where to go, who to know. Human beings are amazingly adaptable. She's hungry for that disorder, actually, to use the word of the previous questioner.
Yes. It certainly beats being stuffed into non-consensually into a pink dress. As she is at the beginning scene. And you have a very vivid picture of her perhaps literally chafing.
Yes, perhaps literally. I think you're absolutely right. And her mother is also wearing a similar dress and looks, except not pink, of course, and looks gorgeous in it. And I come back to that pink dress, which she's wearing in the first chapter. And you sort of, later on, she thinks, that pink dress, how could I have worn it? And then we discover that somewhere she's stuffed it into a dustbin. We feel she's eradicating that pink dress from her being as well as from her history.
Yes. Janice wants to know what differences you feel distinguish British female writers from North American female writers, style, history, or...
Oh, gosh. I don't know. I almost don't know that of course, I do feel there's huge differences, but I'm not even sure that I can characterize what British female writers are like. I don't know that I'm quite, I don't feel I'm like any of my contemporaries exactly. Maybe there's something slightly old-fashioned in what I do. And maybe I feel myself closer to somebody wonderful like Anne Tyler, who's American. I probably feel closer to her than I do to some of my younger contemporaries, much as I like their work. So I think we're too much still in among the trees. And I don't know what this moment is in British literature. It's a little bit all over the place, but maybe it always feels like that. And it's only later that you sort of see what that moment was about in terms of form and style.
Right. Well, here, I will say that here in the US, there is a tendency to group books authored by women under this vague, tremendous heading of women's fiction. And from afar, that does not seem to be as much of an issue in the UK. I don't know if you know that or not.
No, I think perhaps, interestingly, it isn't. No. I mean, there's always Ireland, which is just not fair. I mean, Ireland has a completely disproportionate amount of writing talent. And there's the wonderful, really interesting Sally Rooney, who I think she's really interesting in what she does. And there are a couple of other Irish writers that read enough like her not to feel they're derivative at all, but that they're onto something, a kind of new, lovely mix-up on the page of thought and, a kind of realistic, physical, visceral, sensual sense of life, but mixing that up with ideas in a really ingenious, good way that I like a lot. I don't know. But no, whether I would separate out the women doing that from the men, I don't know. So, oh God, I don't know. So complicated. What a complicated story.
And Wendy would like to know what you like to read.
Well, I've sort of already named, I'm a great rereader of old books as well as new books. And I don't voraciously read new books. I tend to wait till I think I'm going to love it. I don't read everything. So I do like all those old writers I've named. In fact, I just literally last week finished rereading Persuasion. I had a trip to Sweden and I took it with me and Jane Austen and thought how superbly fresh and crisp and contemporary it seems, even though it's 200 years old, which is amazing. I love Colm Tóibín, another Irish writer. It's Not Fair. He's great. I love his books, and I love the last book, The Magician, which is about the novelist Thomas Mann. What else do I love? Yeah, Anne Tyler, I've already said. A very exciting new writer here in Britain is Sanjeev Sahota, who's from the north of Britain, writing a lovely book, China Room. That's been one of my books of this year, which I've been pressing upon everybody I know. That's a super story, partly set in the Punjab in the 1920s and partly in the north of England in the 1980s. Beautifully managed dual narrative. That can be a bit tedious sometimes. One's read lots of books that do that crisscrossing. He just carries it off to perfection. That's a good book. Oh, I know an American author I really am just starting to discover. I've just read my first one of her books, which is Rivka Galchen.
Yes.
Am I saying her name right? Yeah.
You are. Yes.
Yeah. I thought Everybody Knows Your Mother is a Witch was a super book. Absolutely brilliant. Yeah.
And Dee wants to make sure that we mention that she really enjoyed After the Funeral in the New Yorker. And Carol wants to know how you decide what will be a short story versus a novel, and do your novels come out of your short fiction?
Not really, except once. I wrote a novel, Clever Girl, which did begin with just one short story. And then my feeling at the end of it, which I never usually have, that there was more, that I could go on with this same narrator and tell. I had further things. I knew what happened to her next and next and next. And in fact, it's also the only novel I've ever written in the first person. So it was obviously her, Stella, my heroine, who seized me and made me write her story. But otherwise, I tend to just know, and I you have to wait for the blessing of a short story to come to you, and then you sit on it for a while in your notebook, and you wait till you know what you're going to do with it, because you need, if you like, you need a movement as well as a premise. A novel, you kind of do more spade work. You do more solid thinking rather than waiting for the inspiration. And you think, what will work? What would make a good book? And how could I spread that out? And how would I map it? So I have a very different feeling from the pre-writing conceptual part of a short story and a novel. They feel different, and I tend to not mix them up. And at the end of a short story, you should feel, I know everything about those people and that moment that I need to know. You should feel that. You shouldn't feel, I wish I had the next bit.
Mm. Jerry wants to know if you think the divorce rate was higher during that period. She can't wait to read your book. She says she was a teen and a young adult in the 60s, but she worked before getting married.
I don't know. I'm not a sociologist, but I suspect it. Well, I think there's a funny phenomenon now, isn't there, that marriages are, again, the divorce rate's down. I think I actually have to say, I think there were a lot of very unhappy women, and no doubt some unhappy men, or men also looking across to see that the grass was greener on the other side. Women likewise. There was a reservoir of marital angst, probably, which the sort of social, suddenly relative acceptability outside a narrow ruling class who'd always divorced merrily whenever they wanted to. That social change did, I think, open up a lot of slack. Whereas now, my hunch is, of course, not everybody gets married now, but I think people go into the whole thing more open-eyed. That's probably very naive of me. I think the figures bear me out. They may not be the same in the UK and the US, of course. We need to check this out.
Mm. And Susan would like to hear a little bit about your life in Cardiff. If you're originally from Wales, she wants to know.
I'm not. I'm actually from Bristol, which is the west of England, but very near to Cardiff. It's only a 50-minute drive. But that's not why we're here. We moved here in 1982 when my only child at that point was 2, because my husband got a job here. And actually, I didn't know Cardiff very well at all. We lived here for 30 years. It's a lovely city. Bristol's, where I grew up, is a beautiful city, Georgian city. I have to say, lots of its money coming from tobacco and sugar and slavery to build those beautiful Georgian terraces. Cardiff is a 19th century city, and it's not as lovely, it's not as elegant, but it's a great democratic sort of blue-collar city, if that's the right word for it. I mean, it built on the Industrial Revolution, and it's a very friendly place and a lively place. And we lived here 30 years, we loved it. And then, on a whim, I suggested we should try London. So we lived in London for 10 years, which was fabulous. And I am slightly besotted with it. It's a glorious place to be, but for various reasons, family reasons and personal ones, we're back here, and it's lovely to have a whole house again with a garden instead of just a flat. And we live near a gorgeous park where we can walk, and we have lots of old friends and making some new ones. So it's nice to be back in Wales. It's very special. I haven't got time. I can see we're up to time, and there's lots to say about the differentness of Wales. One thing I can say is we do have a devolved government here, so we are, for many things, still under the rule of Westminster, but we also have a separate sort of political identity, and we have a Labour Party in power here and some very, very decent people running things, and that's awfully nice, like we say in England.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. And I see Marjorie has returned. So I've really enjoyed speaking with you, Tessa.
Thank you so much.
Well, I have returned, and that was a delightful and charming conversation. Thank you so much, Tessa. Thank you so much, Jordana. I know that everybody enjoyed that. That was lovely. I'd like to hear more about your life in Cardiff as well. That's quite interesting. Will you be visiting New York anytime soon? We'd love to have you.
I hope so. Please. I mean, usually in the past I have come over when I've been promoting a new book, but very wisely we decided that this time I should do it all online, but I actually can't wait to be back in your exciting city. My favorite outside.
We can't wait to have you here, and please keep in touch. We'd love to have you as a guest at the Temple Emanu-El Streicker Center. We'd love to show it to you, and I'd love to meet you in person.
I'd love to do that. Thank you, Marjorie.
Great.
And thank you again, Jordana.
So, thank you. And I want to thank everybody who's been watching. This is the end of this semester. As I said, spring semester. Of course, we start this up again, and we're meeting new authors and talking to lots of interesting women to talk to them in the future. I'd like to, first of all, thank Zibby Owens, who's not on today, but she's just a fabulous moderator. I'd like to thank Jordana Horn, who's a wonderful moderator. Her questions are fantastic, and it's really a pleasure to listen to her speak to people. And I would like to thank everybody who's been watching these sessions. We've had 30, as I said, and it's been exciting. And of course, once again, thanks to the Samuel I. Newhouse Foundation for their sponsorship of this series. Thank you, everyone, and join us again. Bye.
Thank you.